The first time Romy Reiner stepped into her family home that Sunday morning, she had no idea her life would change forever. It was supposed to be a normal day, quiet, uneventful, a rare moment of calm in a life that had always been anything but ordinary. But as soon as she opened the front door, she knew something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. The silence that greeted her wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, heavy. Like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to discover what had happened. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine walking into the home of your parents, the people who raised you, the people who nurtured you, and realizing that something is deeply, horribly off. No warning signs, no subtle hints, just a gut-wrenching sense that the world as you knew it had fractured. That was the reality Romy faced when she found the lifeless bodies of Rob and Michelle Reiner, her parents, inside their $13.5 million Brentwood estate. A home that once symbolized wealth, comfort, and family was now a scene of unimaginable horror. The news broke fast. Rob Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, were both stabbed to death in what authorities have described as a suspicious, violent incident. And the person arrested that very night? Their son, Nick Reiner, 32, who lived in the guest house on the property. The story was chilling enough on its own, but the details emerging from the investigation would send shockwaves through a community, a nation, and a world that had always seen the Reiners as a prominent, stable family. But what makes this story more than just a tragic headline? Why has it captured the attention of millions? It's the contradictions, the hidden spaces, the secret warnings, and the tunnel. A tunnel hidden deep within the mansion that no one knew existed. And inside it, investigators found things that defy logic, things that suggest this was no ordinary crime of passion or a sudden act of rage. What they found raises questions about trust, loyalty, and the terrifying secrets families can hide behind closed doors. Think about it. How well do you really know the people you love the most? The people you see every day, the people you invite into your life and your home? Romy had always trusted her parents. She had grown up believing she knew them intimately, that their lives were transparent, that family meant safety. Yet, that morning shattered every illusion, every assumption, every sense of security. And then there's Nick. What could drive a son to allegedly kill his own parents? Was it anger? Jealousy? Financial motive? Or was there something far darker simmering beneath the surface for years, something no one outside the family could have anticipated? Authorities reported that Romy had warned police about a dangerous family member who should be a suspect, a chilling remark that, in retrospect, was a harbinger of the nightmare that would unfold. The mansion itself became a character in this story, a sprawling estate with hidden corners, private passageways, and, ultimately, a tunnel that seemed to hold a secret life within the walls of a home built for comfort and elegance. Investigators described the tunnel as small, winding, and completely unexpected, an architectural anomaly in a house otherwise known for its luxury. What was it used for? Why was it there? And most importantly, what did authorities find inside it? The answers are as shocking as they are disturbing. As the investigation unfolded, more details began to emerge: text messages, emails, phone records, financial documents, and witness statements. Each revelation painted a picture of a family riddled with conflict, hidden resentments, and private tensions that no one outside could have guessed. And yet, amidst all the chaos, the public was drawn to the story, watching in disbelief, trying to piece together a narrative that seemed stranger than fiction. Consider this. The people who discovered the bodies, the investigators who combed through the mansion, and even the neighbors who lived just feet away all spoke of a sense of disbelief and horror. Neighbors who had interacted with the family for years described Rob and Michelle as kind, generous, and approachable. Yet, behind closed doors, things were far more complex and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. And here's where the story deepens. Romy's warnings, which at first seemed vague, began to make sense in the context of what authorities found. There were contradictions between what the family presented publicly and what was uncovered privately. Financial disputes that had been hidden from view, personal conflicts that escalated in secrecy, items discovered in the tunnel that no one had anticipated, items that suggested planning, premeditation, and motives buried deep in the shadows of the Reiners' lives. As you listen to this story, I want you to ask yourself, how well do we really know the people closest to us? How many of us are living in homes where secrets are quietly festering, unnoticed, unspoken, until tragedy strikes? This isn't just a story about a violent crime. It's a story about trust, betrayal, family, and the terrifying unpredictability of human behavior. By the end of this video, you will have heard the details that no one expected, explored the hidden corners of a mansion where nothing was as it seemed, and learned about a family whose public image masked a shocking private reality. And yet, even as the investigation continues and the media rushes to report every detail, some questions remain unanswered. Who truly had the motive? How long had tensions been simmering? And what else might the tunnel reveal if authorities continue to investigate? But what they found in that mansion was not just shocking, it was unthinkable. And the world is only now beginning to grasp the magnitude of the truth. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. This sets up the story, introduces the characters, establishes emotional stakes, teases secrets, and ends with a mini cliffhanger leading into the first chapter. It started like any other Sunday evening. The kind of evening where the air feels calm, the world moves a little slower, and families settle into routines that give them a false sense of security. But for the Reiner family, that calm was about to shatter in a way no one could have imagined. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon in Brentwood, a nightmare had begun, one that would leave the entire neighborhood, the media, and the world reeling. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come from the neighbors. It didn't come from the street. It didn't even come from inside the mansion. It came from Romy Reiner, 27, the daughter who had grown up surrounded by privilege, but now found herself stepping into a scene that was anything but luxurious. She had gone to the house expecting to visit her parents, perhaps share a quiet dinner, maybe even just catch up on their usual Sunday chatter. But when the door opened, the silence hit her like a physical blow. Imagine the moment. You walk into the house of your parents, expecting warmth, light, laughter, and instead, you find emptiness. Not just empty rooms, but a silence that screams, that presses in on your chest, that tells you instinctively that something is very, very wrong. Romy's eyes darted across the living room, the kitchen, the hallways. The furniture was untouched. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet, the air felt heavy, unnatural, wrong. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't. She had to see, had to know, had to understand what had happened. What she found was worse than she could have imagined. The bodies of Rob and Michelle Reiner lay in their own home, victims of a brutal, violent act. Both were stabbed to death, a fact confirmed later by authorities. The image of her parents, lifeless, violated, silent, was something that would haunt Romy for the rest of her life. And it was her discovery that set the entire investigation into motion. The timeline that night is as chilling as the scene itself. Police reports indicate that Nick Reiner, 32, had been arrested the same evening. He lived in the guest house on the property, a relatively small, private space separated from the main mansion, giving him both independence and proximity. Investigators would later piece together a disturbing picture of a son who may have harbored intense feelings of resentment, anger, or something far more sinister toward his parents. But in those first hours, none of that was clear. The immediate focus was on the scene itself, the mansion, the bodies, and the question on everyone's mind. Why? Neighbors reported that the Reiners had always seemed like a normal, stable family. Rob and Michelle were well known in the community, friendly, outgoing, involved in local events. No one expected violence. And yet, as law enforcement combed through the mansion that night, it became clear that appearances can be deceiving. Families, like houses, have hidden corners. Rooms that remain locked, doors that never open, secrets that never surface until the unthinkable happens. The mansion itself, a sprawling estate in Brentwood worth $13.5 million, became central to the investigation. Every room, hallway, and hidden space was examined. And then there was the tunnel, a discovery that stunned even seasoned investigators. It was small, winding, and completely unexpected. What purpose could it have served? Why was it there? And more importantly, what had been left inside? Authorities would later describe the tunnel as unorthodox for a residential property. Not just a basement or storage area, but a secretive passageway that suggested planning, secrecy, and a purpose beyond mere curiosity. What was in that tunnel? Personal items, perhaps, or evidence of planning. Whatever it was, it added a layer of complexity to a case that was already shocking the world. Meanwhile, the emotional weight of that night extended beyond the walls of the mansion. Romy's discovery forced her into an impossible position, reporting what she saw, facing the reality that her parents were gone, and knowing that her own brother might have been involved. It was a devastating mix of fear, disbelief, grief, and betrayal. And then there was the media. Once the news broke, it spread like wildfire. Social media buzzed with speculation. News outlets scrambled to report the facts, often incomplete, sometimes contradictory. Every update was dissected by a public eager to understand, eager to find meaning in a tragedy that seemed senseless. But beneath the headlines, the investigators were uncovering details that no news story could capture. The hidden tensions, the private conflicts, the secrets that had been buried for years within the walls of a family home that now felt more like a crime scene than a sanctuary. The first hours of the investigation also revealed a troubling dynamic. Romy had reportedly warned police about a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. At the time, authorities could not have fully grasped the weight of that statement. But it would later become a crucial piece of the puzzle, suggesting that those closest to the family had knowledge of underlying dangers, tensions, or threats that had gone unnoticed or ignored for too long. As night fell over Brentwood, the mansion, which had once symbolized comfort and security, became a symbol of chaos, mystery, and horror. Police lights flashed, casting red and blue shadows across manicured lawns. Investigators worked methodically, meticulously, piecing together evidence from a scene that seemed almost cinematic in its terror. It was a stark reminder that violence can strike anywhere, even behind the walls of a luxurious estate. And yet, even with the bodies discovered, the arrest made, and the initial investigation underway, the story was far from complete. The tunnel, the hidden passages, the contradictions in family testimonies, all of it hinted at a deeper, more disturbing reality. The Reiners' lives had been filled with secrets, and that Sunday night, those secrets finally emerged, violent and undeniable. By the end of that night, one thing was clear: this was not just a tragic incident. It was the beginning of a story that would reveal the darkest corners of a family, expose hidden motives, and challenge the very notion of trust and safety within one's own home. But what investigators would uncover next, inside that mansion, inside that tunnel, and within the private lives of the Reiner family, would change everything. And no one, not even the police, could have predicted the full extent of what was waiting to be revealed. When the world looks at a tragedy like the Reiner murders, there's always a question that lingers in the back of every mind. Why? Why would anyone commit such a violent act against their own family? And in this case, that question centers squarely on Nick Reiner, 32, the son who lived in the guest house on the sprawling Brentwood estate. Nick wasn't just any son. By most accounts, he was quiet, somewhat reclusive, and had always lived a life separate from his parents' day-to-day routines. The guest house gave him independence. It allowed him privacy. It kept him close enough to family to maintain appearances, but distant enough to operate under his own rules. But distance doesn't necessarily equal isolation. And in the weeks, months, and years leading up to that fateful Sunday, there were warning signs, small, easily overlooked, and often dismissed as the quirks of a private young man living on his own terms. Neighbors and family friends described Nick as polite, even charming when engaged. He would wave from the guest house driveway, nod to passing neighbors, and sometimes join the family for holidays. But there were cracks in the veneer. Some accounts suggest financial disputes with his parents. Others hint at simmering resentment over decisions made within the household, decisions about inheritance, lifestyle, and family roles that Nick may have interpreted as limiting or controlling. And yet, the public persona of the Reiners was one of harmony, of stability. The idea that a son could be capable of violence seemed impossible to those who had only seen the surface. Psychologists and criminal behavior experts often point out that family homicides rarely erupt without warning. There are subtle cues: sudden aggression, unusual secrecy, withdrawal from social life, or obsessive behavior. In Nick's case, investigators would later describe patterns of isolation, digital secrecy, and unexplained disappearances from the family's public narrative. These signs, when pieced together after the fact, painted a portrait of a young man who may have been harboring more than just typical adolescent or young adult frustrations. And then there's the guest house itself, a seemingly ordinary, modest dwelling tucked behind the main mansion. To outsiders, it might appear as nothing more than a convenient living space. But in the context of the Reiner tragedy, it becomes significant. The guest house was Nick's domain, a controlled environment where he could manage who came and went, what was said, and what remained hidden. And it is here that investigators first began to notice discrepancies. Items missing from the main house, digital footprints that didn't align with family statements, and unusual activity patterns during the days leading up to the murders. Nick's relationship with his parents has become a focal point for both investigators and the public. On one hand, he was a son, living under the same roof for years, part of family routines, celebrations, and milestones. On the other, reports suggest a strained dynamic marked by resentment, confrontation, and possibly a growing sense of detachment from the life his parents were leading. Friends and acquaintances have hinted at moments of tension, arguments over money, disagreements about life choices, and, in some accounts, subtle threats or ominous comments that were never taken seriously at the time. As law enforcement delved deeper into Nick's life, they began piecing together a timeline of behavior that raised more questions than it answered. Where had he been in the hours before the murders? What communications had he had with friends, family, or anyone outside the home? And, perhaps most importantly, what was going through his mind as he moved through a property he had known intimately since childhood, into spaces that would soon become crime scenes? It's crucial to understand that Nick's life in the guest house was not isolated from the mansion. Surveillance footage, timestamps on digital devices, and witness accounts suggest movement between the guest house and main house in ways that would later become critical to investigators. There was a rhythm to his presence. A pattern that might have seemed mundane but, under scrutiny, revealed potential opportunities, planning, and a level of awareness that could only come from living in close proximity to the scene. The psychology of familial violence is complex. Experts often describe it as a combination of opportunity, motive, and perceived justification. In Nick's case, the opportunity was undeniable. Proximity, familiarity with the estate, knowledge of routines, and an understanding of how his parents interacted with each other and with the household staff. Motive, however, remains a mix of speculation and evidence. Authorities are investigating possible financial disputes, emotional resentment, and perhaps deeper, more hidden personal grievances that could have festered for years unnoticed by those outside the family. Friends of Nick have described him as capable of warmth and affection in certain contexts, yet prone to brooding silence in others. He had hobbies, interests, and routines that were largely solitary. Time spent in the guest house, perhaps on personal projects, digital pursuits, or private contemplation. But what lurked beneath these outwardly ordinary behaviors? Investigators are still piecing together the subtleties of his personality, his private frustrations, and the way those frustrations might have escalated in the days and weeks leading up to the murders. One of the most chilling aspects of Nick's situation is the duality of his life. To the outside world, he was a son living independently yet connected. To investigators, the picture emerging is far darker. One of careful observation, planning, and a proximity to the crime scene that cannot be ignored. Every footstep, every access to the mansion, every moment in the guest house is now being analyzed for meaning, intention, and evidence of premeditation. And yet, despite all the scrutiny, there are elements that remain mysterious. For instance, what exactly triggered the final act? Was it a sudden confrontation, a long-planned escalation, or a mixture of both? A moment where long-simmering tensions erupted into violence? Those questions linger in the minds of investigators and the public alike. The answers are elusive, buried among the walls of the mansion, the contents of the guest house, and the unspoken dynamics of a family whose private life was far more complicated than anyone realized. As we consider Nick's role in this tragedy, it's impossible to ignore the broader implications. Families are often assumed to be safe spaces, sanctuaries from the outside world. But in this case, the lines between sanctuary and danger were horrifyingly blurred. The guest house, once a place of privacy and independence, became part of a crime scene. The walls that should have protected him and the parents he allegedly harmed instead bore witness to a violent rupture in family bonds that would shock everyone who knew them. The investigation into Nick's life, his actions, and his relationship with his parents continues to reveal contradictions and puzzles. Friends, neighbors, and family members provide accounts that sometimes conflict, creating a narrative filled with uncertainty, suspicion, and, at times, disbelief. It's a reminder that even in seemingly ordinary lives, darkness can fester unnoticed. And when it erupts, it leaves devastation that ripples far beyond the immediate victims. By the end of that night, the guest house was no longer just a private dwelling. It became a central piece of a larger, chilling puzzle, a puzzle that would take investigators months to unravel, and that would reveal the depths of tension, secrecy, and possibly malice that had existed in the Reiner family for years. Every action, every decision, every hidden corner of that property suddenly mattered. And yet, even as authorities began their work, one element remained elusive: the tunnel. A space that Nick, living in close proximity, would have known about, perhaps used, and perhaps kept hidden. What secrets did it contain? What role did it play in the events of that night? The answers, when uncovered, would shock even seasoned investigators and force the public to confront a reality far stranger than fiction. The son in the guest house was not just a witness to tragedy. He was at the center of it. And the full story of what led to that moment, and what was hidden behind the walls and in the tunnels of the Reiner estate, had only just begun to emerge. But what was discovered next, inside the mansion, in spaces no one had imagined, and in the dark corners of the family's private life, would reveal a truth more horrifying than anyone could have predicted. The Reiner mansion had always been impressive. From the outside, it was the kind of estate that defined luxury. Expansive lawns, manicured gardens, high stone walls, and a facade that projected elegance, stability, and perfection. Inside, the home reflected a similar sensibility: tasteful decor, spacious rooms, and an unmistakable air of wealth and comfort. But, as investigators discovered, appearances can be deceiving. Behind its polished surfaces and grand entrances, the mansion held secrets. Hidden spaces, tunnels, and private corners that would become central to one of the most shocking investigations in recent memory. Imagine walking through a house that seems ordinary, only to find it hiding corridors and rooms that defy logic. Spaces you weren't supposed to know about. The Reiner estate was more than just a luxurious home. It was a labyrinth. Hidden panels, inconspicuous doors, and secret staircases led to areas that were intentionally obscured from the family's guests, visitors, and even staff. These weren't the kind of hidden rooms you see in movies. They were practical, carefully designed spaces meant for privacy, control, and discretion. Investigators first became aware of the mansion's hidden architecture when initial searches yielded inconsistencies. Certain rooms seemed disproportionately large or oddly shaped. Floor plans provided by the family did not match reality. And then came the tunnel, a discovery that would stun even seasoned officers. The tunnel was small, narrow, and winding, running beneath a section of the mansion and connecting spaces that appeared unrelated. It was the kind of construction that required foresight, investment, and purpose. Whoever had built it had been deliberate. What was the tunnel used for? Theories abound. Some suggest it was simply a private passage for the family. An escape route, perhaps, or a way to move around the estate unnoticed. Others believe it may have had a more sinister function, a place to store things that no one else should see. Investigators reported finding evidence inside that suggested it was more than just a passageway. Personal items, hidden belongings, and other materials indicated activity that had been concealed for years. The existence of hidden spaces raises immediate questions about trust and secrecy. Who knew about these areas? Were they part of the family's private life? unknown even to Romy and Nick? Or were they spaces that certain family members controlled entirely, using them to hide conflicts, documents, or even intentions? The tunnel's location and design suggested that it could only have been accessed by someone familiar with the mansion's layout, a person who knew not just the floor plan, but the habits, routines, and vulnerabilities of everyone in the house. As police and forensic teams mapped out the mansion, they found more anomalies. Walls that seemed solid turned out to have hidden compartments. Staircases led to dead ends, or to spaces that opened up into small, private rooms. Every discovery heightened the sense that the Reiner estate was more than just a family home. It was a carefully managed environment, a place where secrets could be stored and, perhaps, sins could remain hidden. The mansion's architecture itself began to tell a story. Rooms built for comfort and entertainment were adjacent to spaces designed for isolation. Living areas flowed naturally, projecting openness and warmth, while hidden corridors created opportunities for privacy, observation, and movement without notice. It was a duality that mirrored the family's own image, publicly perfect, privately complicated, and perhaps privately dangerous. Investigators also found that certain hidden spaces contained items that were, at first glance, ordinary. Boxes of personal documents, photographs, and letters. But upon closer inspection, these items revealed contradictions. Financial records that didn't match what the public knew, communications between family members that hinted at disputes and tension, and notes that suggested awareness of potential danger or conflict. It became clear that the mansion's secrets were not just architectural. They were deeply human. There were also practical implications. Hidden spaces can serve as storage, but they can also conceal evidence. In this case, investigators speculated that the tunnels and secret rooms may have played a role in the events leading to the murders. Could they have been used to move unnoticed between areas? Could they have provided an escape route or a private place to plan? Every angle had to be considered. The discovery of the tunnel also raised questions about timing. When was it built? By whom? And why? Architects and builders familiar with the estate noted that the construction was meticulous, suggesting someone with both resources and intent. The tunnel was not a haphazard addition. It was a deliberate part of the mansion's design. And that design had consequences, especially on the night of the tragedy. Hidden spaces in homes are often romanticized in popular culture. Secret rooms for treasure, passageways for intrigue. But in the Reiner mansion, these spaces took on a far darker reality. They were not just curiosities. They were central to understanding how events unfolded, who had access, and what actions may have been possible. Investigators noted that familiarity with these areas could have given someone an advantage, whether for hiding, observing, or carrying out actions without being seen. The psychological impact of these hidden spaces cannot be understated. For Romy, discovering that parts of her family home were inaccessible or hidden added a layer of betrayal to the trauma of that night. For authorities, it complicated the investigation, introducing unknown variables and raising the stakes for every decision. And for the public, the idea that a luxurious estate could conceal such mysteries challenged assumptions about safety, wealth, and family trust. Moreover, the hidden spaces suggested a family dynamic that was more complex than initially understood. Perhaps these areas were meant to protect, to safeguard privacy, or even to shield family members from one another. Or perhaps they were symbols of control, secrecy, and hidden power dynamics that had been present for years. Either way, the mansion itself had become a character in the tragedy, a silent witness to tension, planning, and, ultimately, violence. And then came the moment that no one expected. Inside the tunnel, investigators found items that changed the trajectory of the investigation. Objects that suggested premeditation, behaviors, and secrets that no one outside the family could have imagined. Evidence that indicated the events of that night may not have been entirely spontaneous, that long-simmering issues may have finally erupted in a violent culmination. By the end of their initial search, it was clear that the mansion's hidden spaces were not just architectural oddities. They were critical pieces of a puzzle that investigators would spend months trying to solve. Every secret passage, every concealed room, and every hidden corner told part of a story about a family that appeared perfect from the outside, but was hiding turmoil, danger, and perhaps even deadly intent from the world. But the most shocking discoveries were yet to come. Items, spaces, and clues within the mansion hinted at truths so dark and unexpected that even seasoned investigators admitted to being shaken. And what was found in the tunnel would eventually force everyone, family, police, and the public alike, to confront a reality that was far stranger and more terrifying than anyone had imagined. The hidden spaces of the Reiner mansion had always been there, silent and unassuming. But on that night, they became witnesses. And what they revealed next would change everything. Romy Reiner's role in this tragedy cannot be overstated. She was the one who walked into the mansion and first realized that something was irreversibly wrong. The shock, the horror, the disbelief, it all landed on her shoulders in that first, unthinkable moment. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Romy's experiences and insights went far beyond the initial discovery. Her revelations, her warnings, and her actions would become central to understanding what had been happening behind the closed doors of the Reiner family for years. Imagine being 27 years old, walking into the home of your parents expecting a normal visit, and instead confronting the lifeless bodies of the two people who raised you. The emotional trauma is unimaginable. Fear, grief, and shock intertwine, leaving you paralyzed, yet forcing you to act. Romy's instincts kicked in immediately. She called authorities, relayed what she had seen, and, most importantly, warned them about a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. In those few words, she encapsulated years of observation, intuition, and perhaps fear that no one else had taken seriously until that night. Her revelation is not just a minor detail. It's a key to understanding the dynamics of the family. Romy had been privy to private conversations, subtle threats, and behaviors that indicated a tension simmering under the surface. Unlike neighbors or casual acquaintances, she saw the interactions between her parents and her brother, Nick, in a way that gave her insight into possible motives and risk factors. That awareness, while invaluable, also carried an immense emotional burden. She was forced to confront the possibility that her own brother could be involved in the deaths of her parents. A terrifying prospect for anyone, let alone someone who had grown up in a family she trusted. Romy's warning to authorities is chilling not only because of its accuracy, but because of the foresight it implies. How long had she known, or at least suspected, that danger existed within her family? Was it months, years, decades? Investigators later noted that Romy's testimony included observations of unusual behaviors, secretive actions, and escalating tensions that may have gone unnoticed or unreported by others. Her perspective provided a lens into a family dynamic that was far more volatile and complex than anyone outside the household could have imagined. The psychological weight of Romy's revelation is enormous. Consider the internal conflict. Loyalty to a brother versus the duty to report the truth, the desire to protect the family image versus the need to confront an unthinkable reality. Romy's decision to speak up, to warn authorities, demonstrates a level of courage that is remarkable, yet it also underscores the tragedy of the situation. She was forced into a position no child should ever face, choosing between silence and survival, ignorance and action. Investigators described Romy's statements as both precise and emotionally charged. She recounted details about her parents' routines, her brother's movements, and interactions that, when pieced together, suggested premeditation and planning. The warning about a dangerous family member was not vague. It was pointed, informed, and grounded in a lived experience of observing someone's escalating behavior. Authorities would later refer to Romy as an essential witness whose insights provided clarity amid the chaos of the investigation. The timing of her revelation is also critical. By alerting authorities the moment she discovered the bodies, Romy ensured that the investigation could begin with immediacy. Every second mattered. The preservation of evidence, the ability to track movements within the mansion, and the documentation of the scene were all dependent on prompt reporting. Romy's presence at the scene, coupled with her knowledge of the family's private dynamics, gave investigators a perspective that they could not have obtained through conventional means. But Romy's revelations went beyond just reporting. She provided context, details about hidden tensions, conflicts over money, lifestyle, and control within the household. She described moments of confrontation, arguments that seemed minor at the time, but, in hindsight, hinted at deeper resentments. She spoke of subtle threats, comments made in frustration or anger, and behaviors that might have seemed inconsequential to outsiders, but carried weight in the intimate context of the family's private life. Her testimony also highlighted the contradictions between the family's public persona and private reality. To the world, the Reiners were stable, affluent, and harmonious. To Romy, the truth was far more complicated. She witnessed disputes, manipulations, and a degree of volatility that belied the calm, curated image presented to neighbors, friends, and the community. These contradictions became central to understanding not only what had happened, but why it may have happened. Romy's revelation also introduces a crucial emotional layer to the story. The grief of losing parents is compounded by the suspicion and fear surrounding her brother's possible involvement. The sense of betrayal, confusion, and moral conflict is palpable. Investigators noted that her emotional state, while understandably distressed, did not hinder her ability to provide accurate, detailed, and actionable information. This clarity amid trauma speaks to her resilience and the urgency of her insight. And yet, even with her testimony, questions remain. How much did Romy truly know? Were there signs she had missed? Could she have anticipated the scale of the tragedy? These unanswered questions add a layer of tension and uncertainty to the narrative, forcing investigators and the public to grapple with the limits of perception, intuition, and foresight. Romy's revelations also forced law enforcement to reconsider the family's dynamics in new ways. They had to examine not just the physical evidence in the mansion, but the psychological, emotional, and relational context of the family. Her observations highlighted that the Reiner estate was more than a luxurious home. It was a space where conflicts, resentments, and hidden behaviors could incubate undetected until they erupted into violence. Perhaps most chilling is the idea that Romy's warning was only the tip of the iceberg. While she identified a dangerous family member, investigators soon realized that the mansion itself held secrets that even she may not have fully comprehended. The hidden spaces, the tunnel, and the concealed rooms suggested that the family's private life contained elements that were unknown even to those closest to it. Romy's insight, while invaluable, intersected with mysteries that would continue to unfold in the coming days, weeks, and months. Her revelation also reshapes the narrative of responsibility and awareness. It raises questions about what family members, friends, and authorities could have done differently, whether warning signs were missed, and how much knowledge can, or should, translate into action. Romy's position was tragic but instructive, highlighting the complexity of human behavior, loyalty, and the difficult decisions imposed by extraordinary circumstances. By the end of that day, Romy had become more than a witness. She had become a linchpin in understanding the Reiner tragedy. Her revelations illuminated hidden tensions, provided critical leads for investigators, and exposed the emotional, psychological, and relational complexities that defined a family forever changed by violence. But the most shocking details of that night were still buried in the mansion, in the hidden spaces and tunnels that Romy had glimpsed but not fully understood. What investigators would find in those spaces would reveal truths so disturbing that even Romy, with all her insight, could not have anticipated the full scale of the horror. The revelations had begun, but the story was far from complete. What came next would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about the Reiners, their family dynamics, and the events that led to that fateful night. The Reiner family had long presented a facade of perfection. To the outside world, they were a picture of success and stability. A high-profile father and mother, a son living independently in the guest house, and a daughter who appeared poised and grounded. But as investigators and insiders began peeling back the layers of the family's private life, it became clear that appearances had been deceiving. Beneath the surface, a labyrinth of secrets, resentments, and tensions had been quietly festering. Secrets that would soon come to light in the most horrifying way imaginable. Family secrets are often subtle. They're whispered conversations, unspoken agreements, and hidden grievances that simmer below the surface. For the Reiners, these secrets were multifaceted: financial disputes, emotional conflicts, and even behaviors that, if revealed, would shock the public. Investigators found evidence that the family's financial situation was more complicated than it seemed. Large transfers of money, inconsistencies in accounting, and disputed inheritances suggested tensions that had likely persisted for years. In families with wealth, money is rarely just about finances. It's about power, control, and influence, and these dynamics can become toxic when coupled with personal grievances. Beyond finances, the family's interpersonal relationships were marked by contradictions. Rob and Michelle, despite their public image as loving and engaged parents, had reportedly clashed with Nick over lifestyle choices, independence, and personal responsibility. Friends and acquaintances noted occasional tension between father and son, hinting at disagreements that, while ordinary on the surface, hinted at deeper resentment. Romy, as investigators would later reveal, had witnessed subtle arguments and incidents that painted a more complicated picture of the household dynamic. One of the most startling aspects of the investigation was the discovery of communications, texts, emails, and digital messages that contradicted the family's public persona. Some of these messages suggested ongoing disputes, veiled threats, and moments of anger that were never visible to the outside world. For example, investigators highlighted exchanges between Nick and his parents that, on the surface, seemed mundane but, in context, revealed frustration and tension simmering beneath polite language. These digital breadcrumbs would become critical in understanding potential motives and the escalating emotional climate within the Reiner home. Neighbors and family friends added another layer of insight. Many had interacted with the Reiners for years and described them as outwardly friendly and generous. Yet, as they spoke with investigators, inconsistencies began to emerge. Some neighbors recalled odd incidents, arguments that broke out unexpectedly, moments of visible tension between Nick and his parents, and behavior that suggested more than ordinary family stress. While no single incident seemed alarming on its own, when combined with the emerging evidence from within the mansion, a troubling pattern became apparent. Perhaps most disturbing were the implications of Romy's warnings. Her statements to authorities suggested that she had long perceived potential danger, particularly in her brother's behavior. This insight forced investigators to re-examine past events and family interactions, searching for clues that could explain how underlying conflicts may have escalated to violence. In many ways, Romy's observations were the key to unlocking the hidden dynamics that had gone unnoticed or unspoken for too long. The family's private life also included moments of secrecy that extended beyond interpersonal tension. Hidden rooms, tunnels, and concealed spaces in the mansion hinted at a life lived with intentional privacy. Some spaces contained documents, items, and personal effects that painted a picture of control and discretion, suggesting that certain family members may have actively managed what others could see, know, or access. These physical secrets, when combined with the emotional and psychological tensions, created an environment in which small conflicts could escalate unnoticed until they reached a breaking point. Financial records revealed further complications. Transfers of large sums between accounts, investments that had been disputed within the family, and other financial irregularities suggested a backdrop of potential motive and opportunity. While it is impossible to attribute causality directly, these findings provided context for the emotional climate of the family and raised questions about the intersection of money, control, and personal conflict. Investigators also uncovered personal journals and notes that offered insight into private grievances and relationships. Some entries reflected frustration with siblings, parents, or lifestyle expectations. Others contained reflections on control, secrecy, and emotional boundaries within the family. These writings, while not legally conclusive, illuminated the psychological landscape of the Reiners household and suggested that conflicts had been quietly escalating over time. Adding to the complexity were contradictory accounts from family friends, staff, and acquaintances. Some painted Nick as a troubled but fundamentally decent young man. Others described moments of unusual intensity, anger, or detachment. These contradictions made it clear that understanding the events of that night required a nuanced approach, considering not just the immediate crime, but the cumulative impact of years of interpersonal tension, secrecy, and conflict. And yet, even with these revelations, the investigation had only begun to scratch the surface. Hidden spaces within the mansion, unexplored tunnels, and undiscovered items suggested that the family's private life contained additional layers of complexity. The mansion itself seemed to reflect the family's hidden struggles, a carefully curated exterior masking the turbulence within. The exposure of these secrets was both shocking and deeply tragic. They revealed a family dynamic that was far more volatile than anyone could have imagined, illustrating how wealth, privilege, and appearances can obscure the darker realities of human behavior. The contradictions between public perception and private reality became a central theme in understanding not only what had happened, but why it might have happened. By the end of the initial investigation, authorities understood that the Reiners tragedy was not a simple case of an isolated act of violence. It was the culmination of hidden tensions, long-standing grievances, and private conflicts that had quietly intensified over years. The revelations exposed not only the depth of the family's dysfunction, but also the potential premeditation involved in the events that unfolded on that fateful night. And yet, even with these insights, one truth remained elusive: the full scope of the secrets hidden within the mansion, and what they revealed about the Reiner family, had not yet been uncovered. The next discoveries would force investigators, family members, and the public to confront realities that were far darker, more complex, and far more shocking than anyone could have anticipated. The family's secrets had been exposed, but the story was far from over. What came next? Hidden evidence, unexplored spaces, and the revelations from inside the tunnel would escalate the horror and redefine everything investigators thought they knew about the Reiners. The investigation into the Reiner murders was, from the start, anything but straightforward. Authorities were faced with a crime scene that was both physically complex and emotionally charged. A sprawling mansion, hidden tunnels, secret rooms, and a family rife with private tensions created a scenario where every detail mattered. And as investigators meticulously combed through the evidence, they began to uncover breakthroughs that would not only advance the case, but also shock the public and redefine the narrative surrounding this tragic event. Breakthroughs in criminal investigations often emerge from a combination of persistence, intuition, and technology. In the case of the Reiners, each element played a critical role. Early on, authorities realized that the layout of the mansion itself could provide vital clues. Hidden passageways and the tunnel offered potential access points and lines of movement that may have gone unnoticed by witnesses or even family members. Investigators used these insights to reconstruct possible scenarios. Who could have moved where, when, and with what purpose? Each analysis revealed a level of complexity in the crime that was far beyond a spontaneous act of rage. Forensic breakthroughs were equally significant. Crime scene analysts meticulously documented every detail, from fingerprints to blood spatter, from footwear impressions to digital device logs. Even minor details, like the angle of a discarded object or the placement of a personal item, provided critical insight into the sequence of events. Each piece of evidence was cross-referenced with digital records, witness statements, and physical layout to build a timeline that could clarify the seemingly chaotic events of that night. One of the earliest breakthroughs came from examining Nick Reiner's digital footprint. Investigators discovered text messages, call logs, and online activity that suggested unusual patterns in the days leading up to the murders. Some communications were ordinary, reflecting routine exchanges, but others hinted at underlying tension, planning, and possibly premeditation. These findings challenged the initial assumption that the murders were impulsive acts and pointed toward a more calculated approach. Another critical breakthrough involved the tunnel itself. Forensic teams found evidence of movement that aligned with the timeline of the murders. Traces of personal belongings, disturbed surfaces, and other indicators suggested that the tunnel had been used shortly before the bodies were discovered. While the precise purpose remains under investigation, the implication is clear. The tunnel was not just an architectural curiosity. It played a role in the events of that night. Investigators also uncovered items and hidden spaces that raised new questions about family dynamics and potential motives. Financial documents revealed disputes over inheritances, transfers, and accounts that were previously unknown to outsiders. Personal letters and notes indicated simmering frustrations and conflicts that may have escalated into violence. Even mundane items, like keys, journals, and household objects, were scrutinized for clues about planning, access, and opportunity. Witness interviews contributed to breakthroughs as well. Friends, neighbors, and staff provided accounts that clarified patterns of behavior, relationships, and tensions. Some recollections contradicted earlier statements, prompting investigators to re-examine timelines and assumptions. These interviews revealed inconsistencies in narratives about Nick's behavior, interactions with his parents, and movements around the estate. Each inconsistency became a potential lead, guiding investigators toward deeper scrutiny of certain events and relationships. The combination of digital evidence, physical forensic analysis, and witness testimony began to converge, painting a detailed picture of what may have occurred. Investigators started identifying patterns, moments of preparation, sequences of movement, and interactions that suggested more than random violence. The mansion, with all its hidden spaces, became a map for understanding the crime. Each secret passage, each tunnel, each hidden room providing context for the actions of that night. Perhaps the most significant breakthroughs, however, were psychological. Behavioral analysts and criminal psychologists were brought in to interpret the evidence and witness accounts. They examined the family's dynamics, the relationships between parents and children, and the potential motives behind the actions. Their insights suggested that long-standing conflicts, unresolved grievances, and patterns of control and secrecy could have contributed to an environment where violence became possible. These analyses, when combined with forensic and digital evidence, allowed investigators to form a coherent narrative that explained not just the how, but the why of the tragedy. Authorities also considered the timing of events. The synchronization of movement between the guest house and main mansion, the placement of evidence in hidden spaces, and the timing of communications provided critical insight into the sequence of actions. By reconstructing these timelines, investigators could test hypotheses about who acted first, how opportunities were created, and what motivations might have driven those actions. Each breakthrough narrowed the field of possibilities, bringing the investigation closer to a comprehensive understanding. The breakthroughs were not without challenges. Hidden spaces complicated the collection of evidence, while contradictions in witness statements required careful verification. The emotional impact on Romy, as both a witness and family member, added another layer of complexity. Investigators had to balance sensitivity with thoroughness, ensuring that every lead was pursued without compromising the integrity of the case. And then there were surprises that no one expected. Items discovered in the tunnel and other hidden spaces suggested not just secrecy, but deliberate planning. Personal effects, documents, and traces of activity hinted at intentions that may have been concealed for weeks or months. These findings challenged initial assumptions, forcing investigators to reconsider theories about spontaneity versus premeditation. By the end of the initial phase of investigation, authorities had achieved several breakthroughs. The timeline of events was clearer, the role of hidden spaces was understood, digital evidence provided critical insights, and psychological analyses offered explanations for motives and behaviors. Each breakthrough added depth and clarity to the case, revealing the complexity of a family tragedy that was far more intricate than a simple crime of passion. Yet, despite these advances, the most shocking revelations were still to come. What investigators found in the deeper recesses of the mansion, within the tunnel, and in the private records of the family would push the investigation into uncharted territory. Evidence that challenged assumptions, contradicted prior statements, and hinted at truths that no one could have predicted was waiting to be uncovered. The investigative breakthroughs had laid the foundation, but the story was far from complete. What came next would expose layers of deception, hidden motives, and dark secrets that had remained buried within the Reiner family for years. And as the next discoveries emerged, the case would take a turn so startling that it would captivate the world. The discovery of the tunnel inside the Reiner mansion was more than just an architectural curiosity. It was a turning point in the investigation. Initially dismissed by some as a minor anomaly or a feature of eccentric design, it quickly became clear that this hidden passage held critical clues that could explain not only how the murders happened but why. As investigators descended into the narrow, winding space, the tunnel revealed a story the world was not prepared for. From the outside, the mansion had projected wealth, stability, and family unity. But the tunnel, hidden beneath floorboards and behind panels, told a different story. It was a space designed for privacy, control, and movement away from prying eyes. Whoever constructed it understood the importance of secrecy. Its narrow corridors, concealed entrances, and twisting layout meant that someone familiar with the house could navigate it undetected, while anyone unaware could easily overlook its existence entirely. Inside the tunnel, investigators began cataloging evidence. There were subtle signs of repeated use, scuff marks on the walls, dust that had been disturbed, and fingerprints on previously undisturbed surfaces. Every small detail was significant, providing insight into how the tunnel may have been used leading up to, during, and potentially after the murders. Forensic experts treated the space as both a crime scene and a key to understanding the family's private life. What was most striking was the variety of items discovered. Boxes containing personal belongings, letters, and documents were hidden in recesses of the tunnel. Some suggested planning. Records that could indicate preparation, lists, or notes related to family disputes. Others revealed secrets long kept from the public, from disputes over finances to personal grievances that no one outside the family could have guessed existed. The tunnel, in essence, was a physical manifestation of the family's hidden tensions. Investigators also found evidence of activity that raised immediate questions about timing and intent. Footwear impressions, traces of movement, and placement of objects indicated that someone had been in the tunnel recently, potentially around the time of the murders. It suggested that this passage was not just for occasional use, but may have been integral to the events that unfolded that night. Could it have been a place to hide, a route to move undetected, or even a staging area for actions that would later escalate into violence? Digital forensics added another layer to the tunnel's secrets. Surveillance footage, timestamps on devices, and mobile phone data indicated that Rob Reiner, living in the nearby guest house, had movements consistent with access to the tunnel. Investigators began piecing together a timeline, showing a series of entries and exits that aligned with critical moments of the evening. Each correlation strengthened the possibility that the tunnel was a central part of the crime's execution. The tunnel also revealed something more psychologically revealing. It was more than just a hidden passage. It was a space of control and concealment. Whoever used it had knowledge of the mansion's layout, the routines of the household, and the vulnerabilities of those within it. It symbolized a desire to manipulate, observe, or act without detection, reflecting a mindset that combined secrecy with opportunity. Among the items found were notes and documents that hinted at premeditation. Investigators discovered records detailing financial disputes, personal grievances, and communications that suggested tension had been building for months, if not years. These discoveries challenged early theories of a spontaneous act, pointing instead toward a more deliberate sequence of events. Perhaps the most shocking find was the presence of objects and traces that seemed to suggest that the tunnel had been used not only for concealment, but for planning. Investigators noted markings on the walls, arrangements of items, and other indicators that implied intentional activity. Every detail mattered. Every observation became a piece of the puzzle. It was as if the tunnel itself were silently narrating a story of secrecy, tension, and potential danger. Rob Reiner's earlier warnings now took on a new significance. Her insistence that a dangerous family member might be involved was now corroborated by tangible evidence. The tunnel, with its hidden recesses and signs of repeated use, suggested that someone within the household had taken deliberate steps to create private spaces where actions could occur unseen. It was a revelation that transformed the understanding of opportunity, motive, and risk in the case. The psychological implications were staggering. Hidden spaces like this tunnel are not merely functional. They reflect a mindset. They speak to control, observation, and premeditation. They also create an environment in which tension can build unnoticed, where conflicts simmer in private, and where violent acts may occur without immediate detection. For the Reiners, the tunnel may have been both a literal and symbolic representation of the hidden fractures within the family. Investigators knew that every detail in the tunnel mattered. Dust patterns, fingerprints, personal items, and traces of movement all contributed to a complex map of the night's events. Reconstructing how it was used provided a critical framework for understanding the broader tragedy. Each new discovery raised additional questions. Was the tunnel a one-time tool for access, or had it been used repeatedly for planning? What secrets had it concealed over the years? And what role did it play in the final, devastating act that claimed the lives of Rob and Michelle Reiner? The tunnel's secrets also hinted at something deeply unsettling, a degree of foresight. Whoever used the space understood timing, opportunity, and concealment. It suggested a premeditated approach to the evening's events, a calculated awareness of how to navigate the mansion, how to access areas without detection, and how to leverage hidden spaces for a specific purpose. By the time the tunnel had been fully examined, it was clear that it was more than just a hidden architectural feature. It was a central piece of the puzzle. It connected movement, timing, motive, and opportunity in a way that made the night's events increasingly comprehensible, yet far more chilling. The Reiner mansion, already a symbol of wealth and status, had become a stage for secrets, deception, and a violent climax hidden in plain sight.